Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 15th of August. We have some really important developments beginning with the Kursk offensive and then looking once again at Russia's advances within Pokrovsk. So we're going to focus on those two parts of the front line today. And as always, we're going to begin with the western axis and then work our way to the southeast. Let's look over here at the western direction, where Rybar now has clarified that the Russian forces are no longer in Gordivka, that the Ukrainians do have a presence here, although they do claim that Uspinovka is currently under some sort of gray zone that neither side has full control over it. And coupled with the fact that Vyzhnapnoy, as of yesterday, is based on actual geolocated footage under control of Ukrainians, it just seems to me likely that the Ukrainians are over here. Because as you may know, the Ukrainians do have a large amount of rear assets. They do have a lot of units that are not actually involved in the whole host, the entirety of the frontline fighting and the deep raids, but they are still present within Sumy Oblast, rather close to the border. And now some of those elements, they are gradually moving towards the border, towards some of the villages that were taken on days 1 and 2, and they're beginning to fortify them so the Ukrainians could really stay here for an extended period of time. And so just as a random example, the 103rd Territorial Defense Brigade over here, they did have some sort of initial involvement in breaking through around the western direction where I'm circling over here. But in days since, they have really not been involved as much. I haven't heard a lot of information surrounding their advances or surrounding their vehicles being involved in assaults. And so it's likely they were gradually rotated out. And they could be the sort of caliber of unit, a territorial defense element that isn't as experienced with the sort of DRG raids and mobile offensive operations. And so it would make more sense for them to be the ones building the defenses here and just solidifying control militarily of the villages that the Ukrainians already passed through. And so just to go a bit to the north, there is some information surrounding additional clashes near Biachovo and Snagost, but I just can't say anything definitive. This area has not really had a lot of videos released over the past 24 hours. There are apparently some clashes around this forested region just west of Lyubiumovka. This region is rather important, as we've talked about in earlier videos, given the fact that this red rectangle shows you guys that there is an important height that is largely under Ukrainian control southeast of Korenovo, and then a bit to the west, there is an extension of that height that is currently in the gray zone. And part of that goes through this particular forested region that is now contested. And you can understand why the Russians would want to defend over there. They don't want to lose control over Korenovo's southern flank and also lose control of the vertical road connecting Snagost to Korenovo. So yeah, the Ukrainians are clashing in that region. Same thing going on a bit to the north with the Ukrainians trying to gain access to this rather important height that is located northeast of the city. For now, there are no updates around here besides the video that I'll get to in a second. But in terms of the sort of silver lining for Russian elevation, right, we have this river to the west of Korenovo, the Seam River. So there is this really massive ridge located on the western bank of that river. And this is the sort of geographic area that gives the Russians the most localized support. It is able to provide fire support and, of course, reconnaissance and just fire control over some of the roads leading into the city, leading towards the front line. And then it also allows the Russians to overlook the battlefield that is currently being contested in the area that I'm marking with an X. And so that is very, very important that the Russians are able to at least have this position. And so the Ukrainians have their own localized positions that are closer to Korenovo. And then a bit farther to the west, the rear is protected by these heights. And speaking of this area west of the Seam River, as of today, the Glushkovsky district, that is what this area of Kursk is called. And you can see that based on Glushkovo over here. It is now being evacuated. This is a mandatory evacuation for the 20,000 or so citizens that are living in this area. So it's pretty clear that the Russians would like to send in reinforcements to this area. A lot of these villages that are especially near the border with Ukraine here, they're sort of disconnected from the main arteries of the Russian road network, because as you can see, the main artery is along the E38 to the north, and then it goes through Rilsk and connects to Korenovo. Then you have one road that sort of branches out over here, and then it connects to Glushkovo. And then you have a bunch of rather small roads that either directly connect or through open fields connect to the villages that you see that I'm marking with this red rectangle. And there's a lot of ambiguity really surrounding whether there are large quantities of Russian reinforcements arriving to some of these villages. And so then it opens up a potential route for the Ukrainians to conduct rather deep raids into Russian territory, into an area towards Glushkovo. So the Russians are aware of that. They want to get civilians out of the way and just very quickly occupy the various villages over here to the best of their ability. And so we know for sure that there is some sort of Russian presence around Snagost because they are conducting defensive operations, they're in counterattacking, but in the other villages, it's not as clear. Now, looking a bit to the north around Safonovka, this is one of the deepest Ukrainian infiltrations of the entire war, and it occurred around August 12th. We could see that it is around, if we're measuring it from this blue line, as we said before, 15 kilometers northwards. And in a previous video, I talked about how the Russian forces from the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade, they were able to ambush and destroy a Ukrainian Cougar MRAP in a Kozak APC. And so now, a couple of days later, we have additional forces from this unit actually going to ground zero and taking photos and releasing videos of the engagements that occurred that day. And so there was a really large Ukrainian column now based on the footage we're seeing, and included those two MRAPs or in Kozak, and then also a Humvee and 4 Rochelle Senators, the Canadian APCs. And so they advanced utilizing, first of all, the ravines over here. They advanced through this region, and that is conducive for rather quick advances because it is this sort of paved route for you, not necessarily in terms of a paved road, but it is this sort of set route that you can use to reach certain settlements. And then nearby, there are, of course, the tree lines they could use for some sort of concealment. And so they use this route, then make it to the road over here. And that's when they're able to actually infiltrate 400 meters into Safonovka itself. We could actually measure with the stick to see how far away it is from the geolocation. And you actually did already have Russian reinforcements in this area. And they were able to ambush, based on the footage we have, using other armored personnel carriers. And they were firing directly with their cannons towards the Ukrainian vehicles. But just based on the extent of the damage caused to these various smaller Ukrainian vehicles, a part of their sort of mobile groupings, it's probably not just from those cannons. Also, based on the sort of damage that was caused, I'm sure that there were also some sort of drone involvement, probably Lancets, but we just haven't received footage of that. But we do have footage of photos being taken of these vehicles along the road as they were destroyed. And perhaps the crews were able to abandon it in time and just on foot withdrew out of Safonovka. And so based on the totality of this evidence, it is clear now that the Russians have been able to repel a large amount of the raids towards this particular village, and that now there is some sort of a larger Russian garrison defending here. And that also means that in Obshi Kolodez, a bit to the west, there probably is some sort of stabilization. But again, that doesn't mean that the Ukrainians don't have a lot of opportunities to continue movement in this 15-kilometer corridor between the current line of contact in and Safonovka, because this area doesn't really have any sort of Russian troop density at the moment. So that could be their next objective. Looking a bit to the southeast, we have this video here, again from Malaya Loknaya, or actually just a bit to the west in Nikolaevka. This is from August 15th, so it is a recent video. It's of a Russian grouping in a minivan. They set fire to a Ukrainian BMP-1 in Nikolaevka. And this is following, I think it was artillery strikes towards the BMP-1. And so then the crew that were inside of it, they got scared. They ran out, hid in the bushes. And I don't think there was any note of them being killed. So they may have been able to escape in this case. But regardless, the footage shows that the one of the Russian soldiers, he actually just got out and set lit on fire the entire BMP-1, so they didn't even try to retrieve it back. And so it shows that this area is a pretty open region that's currently contested, and the Russians wouldn't really want to risk going into it and retrieving it, that sort of drawn out process. So they just decided they might as well destroy it. And that also proves that there is some sort of Russian presence over here, which means that the Ukrainians are not really able to turn Malaya Loknaya into their own sort of fortified base, sort of central hub near the front line that could act as a perimeter, and then use it to allow mobile groups to advance deeper into Russian territory. because now this is the second video from recent days confirming that there is a Russian presence within this cluster of villages. Now, looking at the eastern axis, this is where the Ukrainians have recently had the most success. And this is completely understandable because the Ukrainians here were able to rather quickly solidify control over the western and central parts of Suja. And by that point, in addition to the 22nd Brigade's really important and decisive attempt at advancing along the R200, they were able to cut off a lot of the arteries that would supply the eastern garrison that was located within suburbs like Mirny, comprising soldiers from the 488th Regiment. And so those Russian soldiers, they would always have been at a disadvantage, given the fact that they were being targeted from the western direction over here, from the north as well, putting pressure. Then from the south, you had certain mobile elements crossing over the river and beginning to put pressure on the suburbs. And so it was just inevitable that at some point they'd be squeezed out. And there could be also POWs taken. We're going to get to that in a second. But just to give you guys the confirmation that the Ukrainians have not only taken over the entirety of eastern Suja, but also the nearby suburbs, we're going to look at some videos from this area, because we know that yesterday the 80th Air Assault Brigade was able to cross past the R200 highway, cross past the bridge, and actually traverse into the center of the eastern corner. And that includes various buildings, residential areas, factories. And so now all this area near the rail line is just completely under their control. So they have the rail station and the gas metering plant under their control. Then, of course, Mirny and Bondarevka. So here you have a video from August 15th of a Lancet hitting a Cossack APC in that said village. And there's just a lot of footage of Cossacks being hit as of today, because they really are a vehicle of choice for Ukrainians that really are trying to go in small groups near tree lines and reach certain areas in a quick amount of time without being spotted. But when they are spotted, that's not enough to stop Lancet strikes. And so we're seeing a lot of these Lancet strikes, particularly on the front line. Haven't seen many on the rear. They're more so being used at this moment in time to target the assets that are involved with this offensive. And then looking at Mikholovka, here we also have confirmation of a Ukrainian presence. Cossack hit by a Lancet today. And then here, this is from the 204th Akhmat Regiment. This is specifically the Aida detachment, which is a special detachment within this regiment. They were able to hit a Cossack in Mikhalovka. I think this was using an FPV drone, actually. And you could see that it means that the Ukrainians were able to move in these sort of mechanized assets from Mirny into Mikhalovka or from Martinovka. The axis doesn't really matter. What it means now is that there is no sort of solid Russian line east of Suja that could be fallen back to, which means that the Ukrainians now are in a prime position to just continue pushing and just create this rather large buffer zone between the new front line and the area wherein the Ukrainians within Suja will be located. And so the final step in order to just fully secure their buffer around the R200 and around the Suja suburbs would be to fully clear out Martinovka, where there currently still is some sort of resistance from the Russians, but Ukrainian sources continue to insist that they're pushing the Russians out of the village. And given the presence in Mikhalovka, even if there are Russian forces located here, at this point they would be in a rather compromised position, and they would no longer have the incentive of holding on to Martinovka in order to provide logistical support for eastern Suja. And so it just becomes less logical to hold on to it at this point. And so I could see the Russians being pushed out of there. And then looking at some of the nearby regions, you have Agronom, which on its own is rather isolated, and it is pretty close to the suburbs. So the Ukrainians will have an interest in clearing that area. And then same thing with Kalmakov. And currently Dmitriokov is in the gray zone. So the Ukrainians are pushing into that region as of now. Then you have this chain of villages, which just appears to be the inevitable fallback line. And it runs along this ravine with these various sort of outstretching tree lines. And this is an area where you have Russian elements in Pushkarnoy and Ruskaya over here. And so the Akhmat and 810th elements that are operating here, they are likely now trying to solidify control in this region. And you could see here that it's actually confirmed that there is a Russian presence in this area based on shelling by the 80th Air Assault Brigade and the drone support of the Korn group of the 116th Brigade. And you can't really see any damage caused to the Russians, but it means that the Ukrainians believe they're operating around here. And so, all in all, the Russians can still take solace in the fact that they largely control the heights over here. There's one ridge west of the R200. I'll mark it in red for you guys. Then east of it, there's one that's currently near the line of contact, but on the Russian side. And then there are a few other protruding valleys that I guess I'll mark in green for you guys. Generally along these areas, if you see a village, then it's the valley is probably running through those villages and connecting them together. And then all the areas in between those hinterlands are on the ridges. And so this sort of setup, it really continues rather deep into the Russian line over here throughout this entire X. And so this area more generally is just on higher elevation and does overlook the river valley through which Suja is located. And so the Ukrainians do have an interest in, of course, getting control over some of those ridges in order to provide support for the eastern flank of the city, which they will now turn into their sort of main forward garrison within Kursk Oblast itself. As you guys may know, they're already letting in foreign journalists, like Italian ones, into Western Suja. They're posting a lot of images from there. They're walking out sort of in the open through that region. And something that's interesting is regarding POWs. I can't speak to any sort of POW captures in Eastern Suja, although it wouldn't surprise me if there were from the 488th. But, of course, today you guys may have seen the videos from the SPU Alpha group. This is a unit that was moved to here, generally operating around Kherson previously. And they were working in conjunction with the 88th Air Assault Brigade, and they released a lot of footage of 102 Russian soldiers, mainly from the Akhmat forces, probably from the 204th Regiment, and then also from the 488th Regiment that were captured. And the date at which they were captured, again, that could be disputed. People could argue that it happened earlier on during the initial breakthroughs, but this specific trove of troops is new. For instance, it hasn't been accounted for previously, and a specific location hasn't been mentioned, but it would just seem likely that it's on this general Suja axis. What I've seen mentioned as a potential area where they were captured en masse because they were captured together from the same location is that they were around some sort of fortified structure near Olshina or Oleshnia, and that during the initial breakthroughs they were sort of cut off and then eventually surrendered as the SBU team was clearing out these remnants. That's possible. Maybe they were within Suja, but based on the footage released, they were located, these Russian prisoners, 102 of them, within a fortified bunker underground. It had a tunnel system, it had a canteen, it had showers, I think, an armory. So it was actually really well built in terms of the interior, and also did have that large concentration of forces. But the issue is that's all fine and well, but you can't really utilize that to its maximum at such a fast pace when you're surprised and you can't communicate with the outside world. And so then it makes sense that they surrendered. So now if we're getting a cumulative count of the POWs taken by the Ukrainians, of course we have those 53 from the initial border crossing. We have the 60 or so from the video, mainly consisting of Akhmat forces. And then you have a lot of other ones that will inherently be disputed just due to how many of them have been posted. And there's going to always be a back and forth about how many of them are overlaps. And so I'd say just a safe estimate from just day-by-day tracking of the videos is around 400, just based on the current footage we have. It could be higher if there's footage that hasn't been released yet. But also, FT, they wrote an article just today where they talked to some of these Ukrainian soldiers on the ground and some of the local commanders, and they didn't specify a number, but they did say that the amount of Russian POWs is in the hundreds. So that's an important distinction. It's not over 1,000, it's within the hundreds. And so then it does give some sort of, it does lend some credence, you could say, to the 400 number that I'm telling you guys about. Now, looking at the southeastern district, we have here this video from Spalnoy, again showing us that the Ukrainians are still in this village. And what we see here is the 382nd Battalion of the 810th Marine Brigade. They shelled Ukrainians. I think there was like 5 of them within Spalnoy. So again, you can see the Russians spotting them, targeting them. This is the furthest extent at this point in time of the Ukrainian attacks. And there are reports from Rybar that the Russians have been able to get control over Kamishnoy and Krupets. And so now it does appear there is an attempt by the Russians to stabilize the line here. Some reinforcements arriving, trying to prevent a deep break into an area like Giri and Belaya. And as of the past 48 hours, they've been successful in preventing that sort of worst case scenario. And then within Cherkasskaya Konopelka, at this point, it appears that the Russians are no longer here. The Ukrainians are operating there. But then Rybar claims that Fanasivka is under Russian control. So for now, that is something that is disputed. We can't say with full certainty. Additionally, we have a video today that is rather interesting. It's not this one here, but there's one a bit to the south. I'll show you guys the measurements from how far away it is compared to the front line. If we see, it's about like 12 kilometers away from the border, but now the Ukrainians are in control of the other side of the border. So if we're measuring it out from an area in, I guess, Belgorod Oblast, it's like 17 kilometers away, 18 kilometers away. It's this video here, which, damn, sorry, that's the wrong video. It's actually this video over here. So this is from August 15th. It's an Iskander M. It destroyed an M142 HIMARS MLRS, and this was a part of the Tivas element of the 148th Artillery Brigade. This is a rather important artillery brigade operating in southern Donetsk, but now at least one of their elements is operating further north. And so this is, if we're going to measure it out, just 9 kilometers away from the border and like 26 kilometers away from Ulanok. So this is interesting. The Ukrainians felt comfortable moving in HIMARS very close to the border because of the buffer created by the recent offensive. And of course, they're staging them within the forest to provide some sort of concealment from the Lancets or from some sort of Orlan reconnaissance drone. And now there were strikes reported overnight near some bridges in Glushkovo. So it could be that. It could also be some of the other strikes that were reported on the Russian rear over the past 24 hours. But the HIMARS were active here, providing some support for the Ukrainian forward elements. And at this point, at some point, they were spotted. And the footage actually shows how the Russian reconnaissance drone, which really has an amazing resolution, it spotted 2 of the missiles being fired. And then at that point, it destroys the vehicle. And there's this massive secondary explosion confirming that it is destroyed. And so I think visually speaking, there are a lot of videos where there's a lot of ambiguity and a lot of debate surrounding whether it's actually a HIMARS system. That's 2 where there's like 100% certainty that I haven't seen any Ukrainian source sort of disregard or this one and another one. So that would be 2 that are just completely undisputed. And just while we're on the topic of Ukrainian shelling, there was reporting from Soloviev where you could see here in Legov, there were reporters and they witnessed how artilleries, I think they said it was cluster munitions, but definitely there was a strike here on the Logov rail station. And this makes a lot of sense because, again, a lot of the equipment and the troops that are coming in, they're going to be passing through this key logistics hub. So the Ukrainians, it is really important for them to very quickly act and try to target these rear facilities, try to prevent the Russians from then moving them 20 kilometers southwards to the front line. And so that's when they need to move in their really important MLRS systems closer and closer to the front. But then in turn, it becomes more exposed to the Russian side. And then you have incidents like the one that just happened. Now, moving on to the Pokrovsk front, here there was also a recent article, and this was from Politico actually. They spoke to the spokesperson, one of them from the 110th Mechanized Brigade, the unit operating over here, really notable unit that's been defending on and off around Avdiivka for over half a year at this point. And now they're once again involved in defense around the Torets River line, which the Russians have just infiltrated. So they're defending in a ridge located just north of said line. And so since the opening of the Kursk front, the spokesperson for this unit says that they have received less ammunition and that generally the situation has actually become more difficult in spite of a lot of hopes that the redirection of certain elements generally from Ukraine proper, where Russia's in control, towards Kursk would reduce the intensity of attacks. It has actually increased since the beginning of the Kursk offensive, even though there are some elements of units that are located in the Pokrovsk area, like the 15th Brigade over here, that do have certain conscripts that instead of being sent to here, they were moved very quickly to Kursk. That doesn't really have an impact on the troops that are already here and already have the momentum and aren't in need of an immediate rest or rotation. So they can just continue pushing on and already exploiting the same underlying gaps and issues that the Ukrainians have when it comes to attrition, when it comes to resources, logistics, topography, the list goes on. And so then just zooming in here, we could see that there is now confirmation of the reports that I talked about in yesterday's video from the 25th Battalion of the 47th Brigade with an FPV strike onto a cellar in Jelane. Now we know the Russians are in control of this entire village. Looking a bit to the west, we have confirmation that the Russians are in Mykolaiivka. And this is actually a rather deep video. It's a video here from the strike drone company of the 47th Brigade. So they are really active, this brigade, all over the Pokrovsk salient, trying to just contain the Russian advance. So here they destroyed a Russian armored personnel carrier, and then you could see as the survivors flee. And then they talk about how there's additional footage, which has not been released yet, of a tank targeting those same troops hiding in a house. So we're going to have to wait and see if that claim is true. But in any case, based on the area where the Russians were located, it's an advance rather deep into the village of around 900 meters, reaching the horizontal road that connects Mykolaiivka to Novozhelane to the east. So now Novozhelane is not only going to be under immense pressure from Zhelane, but also from this western direction. Mykolaiivka also, again, you can see how the Russians are expanding their horizons here. And this actually puts a lot of danger into the area around Novohordivka, because now you can see movements towards Marinivka and then a southern flank to target Novohordivka, in addition to the obvious attacks that are going to be coming from Orlivka and from the rail line, because the Russians are just continuing to advance along this rail embankment because of the elevated position and the support and concealment from the two windbreaks nearby. And so you could already see how the battlefield is being shaped in a way that would make it very hard to defend within this particular village. And then if we're looking southwards, it's really surprising to say this, but the Russians are only about, if we're measuring it, 5-6 kilometers away from Selidove. There was a period in time when it was like 20-25 kilometers away, and we weren't even looking at it on the front line. But the Russians have been able to infiltrate so deep past the Vovcha River over a rather short period of time, like 11 kilometers, that now it's within the purview of the Russians. And Selidove is a very important area, large staging ground for logistics and reinforcements that always come in. A lot of equipment is stored here. You could see how all these various roads are branching out. Selidove actually acts as a rear coordination hub for the trenches that are currently being built by the Ukrainians along the Vovcha River that will eventually serve as a fallback line. You could see that I dotted it in red for you guys, but this will eventually act as a fallback line for the Ukrainians that are currently defending in the Krasnohorivka and the Maximilianivka and the Velska area. Once they lose control over those forward nodes, they would have to eventually yield control over these fields and fall back to this particular river. And this river is important because it is so heavily fortified, and there are so many villages where you could, station troops in. And then to the west of the river, you have just this massive ridge that the Ukrainians will be able to take advantage of. But while all of this is occurring, just to the north, the Russian forces are already knocking on the doorstep of the city that is coordinating all this potential defensive long-term operation, that being Selidove, with now the Russians only about 5 kilometers away. And so that will really put a question mark about the viability of this sort of long-term Ukrainian defense strategy, including the areas where they spent a lot of money and time building trenches, if all of that is going to be subverted and sort of attacked from the north in an area where the Ukrainians really were not expecting any of that, because they were really hoping that their defenses further northwards along the Vovcha River would be enough to hold back the Russians. But you could see that this was in vain, and that now there is a really massive potential danger to this new Ukrainian line that I've talked about for months on my channel, and we're going to see how that begins to unfold in the coming months. But because there are so many other areas where the Russians do have potential avenues to advance, then it's not a foregone conclusion that the Russians will put all their resources into this particular southern direction, because again, they're also advancing through Zhuravka at the moment, trying to flank Hordivka, both from the south, but also attacking directly from the east. And that's where we have this other geolocation. Let's zoom in. This is a geolocation from the 151st Brigade, still operating around Pokrovsk, despite rumors that they were moved to Kursk. They're actually still here. And so they conducted FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers in trees, in shacks, near apartments. They were walking through roads, and also in a portable toilet. And so if you zoom in, you could see that there were some Russian soldiers operating near some high-rise buildings in the area. And these are the first houses that are actually coming under Russian control within this town. And so you're beginning to see the formulation of a new sort of urban-esque battle. And so that's all after today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.